Even in like the trailers for this movie, I think they gave that away. And I don't remember ever thinking, oh, Schwarzenegger must be the bad guy, and then being surprised by it.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yannis Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. On this show, we democratize the film criticism conversation by bringing on fans and critics alike to dig into their personal connection to a current or classic release. This episode, we're going to be talking about the 1991 James Cameron film Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and I'm honored to welcome to the show Josh Bell. Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, to people that don't know about your writing and specifically your podcast, Awesome Movie Year, tell them a little bit about the concept behind that and where they can find you.
Yeah, Awesome Movie Year is a podcast that I co-host with Jason Harris, who's a comedian and a filmmaker. We're both based here in Las Vegas. And what we do is in each season of the podcast, we take a look back at the films of a certain year. So in our first season, we talked about the films of 1994, and we recently wrapped that up, and we've launched our second season talking about the films of 2007. So we have kind of different categories that we take a look at for each year, like the biggest movie at the box office, the best picture winner at the Oscars, things like that are kind of determined for us. And then some other things that we pick out, notable documentary or foreign film or a future cult classic. So a mix of things that were kind of notable during that year, and then things that maybe we look back on as having an impact on film history going forward. That's
really cool. So I know you just started the 2007 season. Are you going to do the same categories that you did for 1994, or is it going to be a little bit of a surprise as you go along?
No, I mean, there'll be plenty of surprises, but, please listen. But no, the idea is, I think that we have those same categories pretty much for every year. So we use that as kind of a lens to look at the year. So yeah, again, the categories that we used in 94, we're going to look at again for 2007, and that's our plan going forward. For future years, there's some things like we've looked at film festival winners like Sundance and Cannes, and those aren't always necessarily Sundance, especially if you go back far in film history, didn't exist. Mm-hmm. So we may make a few adjustments along the way, but for the most part, our plan is to kind of approach each year in the same way so that we can kind of analyze each year from that same perspective and look at what it was then and how it's kind of impacted film as it's gone forward.
Right. More of an apples to apples comparison. So this being 2019, obviously there's a lot of, at least on this podcast, there's been a lot of talk about that it's 20 years since 1999 and that being a pivotal year for cinema. What was your thought process for selecting 1994 to start with, as opposed to, I guess, something more obvious like 1999?
Well, I think the thought process was that 1999 was too obvious. Mm-hmm. And actually, exactly. When we were first discussing like launching this podcast, originally we talked about 1999. And I think because there is so much attention on it now, there is at least two other podcasts that are solely devoted to the movies of 1999. So we felt like as we were starting out and we're new, and especially I think The Ringer has a podcast about 1999, and that's obviously much more high profile, that we wanted to go in a slightly different direction, at least right now when there's so much attention on 1999. So for us, I'm 39 and Jason is about the same age. And so for us, 1994 was a year where we were teenagers. We were first kind of getting into film, getting excited about seeing interesting different kinds of movies. For Jason, especially getting excited about maybe making movies. So it seemed like a good year for us that was kind of formative in our development as movie fans. And then it's also, I mean, as we say on the podcast, every year is an awesome year for movies. But for 94 especially, I think it's a year where there were a lot of movies that made a lasting impact and that people are still talking about. And it just happened, it kind of worked out well for us that we talked about things like The Lion King and Clerks and Pulp Fiction that ended up having a lot of resonance this year, whether it was because of the Lion King remake or Quentin Tarantino's new film or Kevin Smith's new projects that he's working on. So hopefully we can draw those connections and people will find that interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's 1984. I'm a little bit younger than you. I'm 36, so but still, even that being the case, I was still old enough to be aware of everything that was happening in 1994, and you know, I remember seeing The Lion King and The Mask in theaters. I remember when Pulp Fiction was out and not being allowed to go see it as an 11-year-old, which is probably a smart move on my parents' part. But yeah, I mean, even just looking at the layout of films that you've covered, like you know that Oscar season specifically is so colored by Forrest Gump versus Pulp Fiction, and then yet I feel like in a lot of ways Shawshank Redemption, which you didn't even get a chance to cover, that's how much was going on in 1994. It is still kind of endures in the same way, and it's a really packed year of populist hits, and then also kind of the emergence of now it's more controversial now, the Weinsteins and all of that, with that whole like artistic as far as you mentioned with Kevin Smith and Quentin Tarantino and stuff. So it's a really rich year. So I think that was a good call to go with 94. That's a lot of stuff to choose from, and I'm really glad that you guys talked about New Nightmare, because I think that movie is severely underrated.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we each had an episode where we just kind of picked our personal, not necessarily our personal favorite, but one movie that we really wanted to talk about. And that was my pick. And I'm a big horror fan. I'm a big Wes Craven fan and Nightmare on Elm Street fan. And Jason is none of those things, my co-host. So we had an interesting kind of back and forth about that movie because he was less into it than I was. But of course, that makes for hopefully an interesting podcast when we can have a bit of a debate back and forth about the merits of a movie. And we definitely talked a lot about what you were saying about the Pulp Fiction versus Forrest Gump kind of matchup that existed in that year. And we considered doing an episode on Shawshank. I think part of the thing that we're doing with this podcast is because we're limiting it to just a certain number, and we only did 12 episodes for each year. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we're going to have to leave stuff out. And I think that is almost part of the point too. Like, we're just giving you a snapshot of the year in a bunch of different areas. You know, we talked about like the Sundance winner for that year, for example, which is a movie called What Happened Was by Tom Noonan that very, very few people have seen. And we could have replaced that with a more well-known movie. But I think we wanted a range of things from obscure to super popular in order to give you a sense of the year. And so hopefully going forward, that'll be something that people find interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and that's part of why I love doing this show, is that it's, today we're talking about Terminator 2 Judgment Day. That's one of the, most popular movies of all time in large regard, and a huge like cultural touchstone. And then I talked about the Station Agent, a little tiny movie, starring Peter Dinklage from 2003, and like Sing Street, which is, I think, kind of emerging cult status at some point. I hope, fingers crossed on that one. But yeah, I think that's always fun to get a chance to shine a light on films that listeners might not, otherwise come across.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love The Station Agent. I think that's a great movie. So I look forward to hearing about that. And Sing Street, also excellent. We have an episode coming up for Awesome Movie Year in our current season talking about Once, another John Carney movie. Nice. So yeah, that should be hopefully, again, interesting one for people to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So people definitely check out Awesome Movie Year if you're interested in listening about film, which obviously you're listening to this show, so let's hope so.
Yes.
So this episode we're going to be talking about Terminator 2 Judgment Day. So without further ado, let's get to a little bit of the trailer right now.
I need your clothes, your boots, and your motorcycle.
29-year-old female diagnosed as acute schizoaffective disorder. She believes that a machine called a Terminator was sent back through time to kill her.
My son, he's in great danger.
Are you the legal guardian of John Connor?
What's he done now?
There was a guy here this morning looking for him, too.
Yeah, a big guy on a bike.
I wouldn't worry about him.
Get down.
Who sent you?
You did. 35 years from now, you reprogrammed me to be your protector here.
He's a Terminator like you, right?
Not like me. T-1000, advanced prototype.
Kill us all!
Go! Come with me if you want to live. We don't have much time. Excellent.
It's definitely you.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Stay down!
I'll be back.
That was a little bit of the trailer for Terminator 2 Judgment Day, directed by James Cameron. So this came out July 4th, the weekend, 1991. So Josh, tell me, what was your experience going to, I'm assuming you probably saw this in theaters when it came out. What was that experience like?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I saw this on July 4th weekend in 1991. I have this memory, and sometimes those are faulty. I would have been 11 years old. I have this memory of going to see it at like the mall movie theater with my dad and coming out of the movie and there being fireworks going off outside.
Nice.
So I'm pretty sure if it wasn't actually on July 4th, it was on that general weekend when celebrations would have been going on. And I was just talking about the formative experience in like 94, being a teenager and seeing all these movies that had a big impact on me. This was a few years earlier, but I feel like this movie just had a huge impact. This is the first movie that I can remember where I would have said, oh, that's my favorite movie ever, when I was like 11 years old, and probably hadn't seen that many movies, but I'd seen enough movies to know that I liked this one most of all. And I still love it. I think there are plenty of movies that I liked as a kid. And I you probably have the same experience where go back as an adult to see some movie that you loved as a kid and you think, what was wrong with me? Why did I love this movie? But this is a movie that to me absolutely holds up. I've seen it many times. I just watched it recently, of course, so I could talk about it here. And I just think it's one of the best action movies ever made. It's one of the best sequels ever made. It's one of the best sci-fi movies ever made. I think like everything about it just works incredibly well. And, so 11-year-old me had the right idea when I saw this movie. And as much as I like the original Terminator, and I'm sure I had seen it on home video or something before, although my memories of it aren't nearly as strong, I just think this one is superior and is just excellent in every way.
Well, that's actually, it's actually a good topic to touch on. What about this movie specifically do you think makes it shine so much brighter than, obviously than any of the sequels that have come after, which we'll probably talk about a little bit, but even brighter than the original?
Well, I think it's just so much deeper and more sophisticated. I mean, part of it is probably just a budget reason. The original Terminator was not a huge budget movie. It was a B movie, really. And Cameron does a great job, I think, with the resources that he had at the time to make that first movie. I mean, I don't want to like disparage it. It's really good. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a little limited in scope, and it works for what it is because it's almost like a horror movie where it's just about this one kind of unprepared woman who's being stalked by this unstoppable killer. The Terminator in that original movie could be Michael Myers or something, with the way he just comes at her and will never give up and can never be destroyed. But I think in T2, what Cameron does is he takes all that stuff that was set up in the first movie that he didn't necessarily think of as this broader mythology, and he builds on it so well so that every little element of that first movie kind of blossoms into this larger like tapestry of storytelling. I mean, just little things like well, the Terminator got crushed. The original Terminator got crushed in this hydraulic press in a factory. Well, what would happen if parts of a machine from the future were found in this factory? Where would they go? And what would someone do with them? And character-wise, too, Sarah Connor is not really that fully realized a character in the first movie. Not that she's a bad character, but again, she's a very recognizable kind of horror movie archetype of the scared woman who's running for her life. But you think about, okay, if you went through that traumatic experience, how would you respond to it? What would you do? And I think you can take it in a lot of different ways. And there's a lot of horror sequels. I feel like where Sarah Connor ends up in this movie, that she's in this mental institution, there are many horror sequels where the final girl from the previous movie is now in a mental institution. But the way he builds on that, and how would she feel about her experience, and what would she do having gone through that and knowing what she knows, like how would she live her life after that? I feel like he just does such a great job of thinking that through and getting every little piece in place. And then he tells a great story, which is a similar story in some ways to the first movie. I mean, the idea of this killer machine coming back from the future to kill you for something that you haven't done yet is scary, is a great story. So he tells that kind of story again and does a really good job of it. And the special effects are amazing. You can't discount the effect of seeing that stuff on screen, which I think largely really holds up. And the acting is good. It's a long movie, but I think it's paced really well. Yeah, like I said, I just really like all the characters. I think it's an emotionally engaging film while also being like exciting and action oriented. It's got a lot of fun one-liners. And to me, this is Cameron kind of at the height of what he does best.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, honestly, I think for my money, this is probably still Cameron's best film. Just because of what you said, the way that he builds off of the original Terminator, which had a budget of $6.4 million. And, made $38 million domestically, which is good for 1984, but it wasn't like by any means like the smash hit of the year. That was obviously Ghostbusters and Gremlins and movies like that. So it wasn't quite at that level, but it basically, I feel like it's also kind of the progeny, like the prototypical film that did okay in theaters and then really blew up when it hit home video. And then that just, it got such a following that then, he really made doing a sequel kind of a mission. And I think after proving, his box office clout with Aliens and kind of dipping into what would ultimately become the technology that he'd used for T-1000 with The Abyss, you can really see his skill set, this like developing from film to film. And I think you still see that now. Every movie, he's pushing technology further and he's like, okay, how can we do what we did before better and then add on to it? And I think this film, in essence, is a great example of that kind of applied to a narrative that, as you said, there are elements of this movie that kind of feel like almost remaking the first one because it, again, is another killer robot sent back to kill a member of the Connor family. But it inverts your expectations, too, with by having Arnold Schwarzenegger's character as the hero. And it kind of flips what the audience and Sarah are expecting on its head. And that great moment where they're both coming at her and she's like not sure which one to run to. Or is that John? I think it might be John.
Yeah, it's. I think if you're thinking of the one in the mall,
yes,
where they're in the hallway there, and that is a great moment. And I mean, it's interesting. I'm pretty sure, and I've seen articles about like the marketing for this movie, the idea that it spoiled that twist, because if you watched the first Terminator and knew nothing else, and then just watched this movie, of course, you think Schwarzenegger is the bad guy.
Right.
So that's such a great twist moment to discover that he's really the good guy. As a storytelling moment, if you remove it from spoilers or whatever, it is a really good inversion. And yeah, John, of course, and there's so much going on with John in that scene too, because not only is he not sure who the good guy is, but he's getting confirmation, like in that moment, that all the stuff that his mother told him is true, which of course he doesn't really believe that. Even maybe if he says he believes it, he can't really truly believe it until he sees that. But there is a great moment too later in the mental institution when John and Schwarzenegger Terminator come to rescue Sarah, and she sees Schwarzenegger coming around the corner, and of course she also assumes that he's there to kill her. And Linda Hamilton is so good in this movie.
She is.
And she has this look on her face of just like
oh, shit,
everything.
Not again.
Yeah, I mean, and not just oh shit, but just like everything that I ever feared in my whole life, the worst possible thing that could happen to me is happening right now. And that's just a great moment.
Yeah, the fact that T-1000 disguises himself as a police officer too, I think is really telling, and just kind of furthers that inversion of expectation. But yeah, it builds upon everything that's set up in that first movie. And Linda Hamilton, I mean, we should just take a moment since we're kind of already talking about her. I think people forget how passive she is in that first one. I mean, she's just basically along for the ride until that the final act of the original film, where she actually is the one that destroys the Terminator. I think she just presses the button and like puts us in a press or something. But yeah, so in this one, it's just such a 180 for her character. And I think, James Cameron gets a lot of crap sometimes because he talks about like, oh, Wonder Woman, she's not a real, feminist hero and thing. What do you kind of your take on his version of what a on-screen hero is? Like, do you remember these comments he made about Wonder Woman? And it's like, she can't be a hero. She's too beautiful or something like that. It was a little convoluted, but I feel like he thinks that he's the be-all, end-all on female heroines. And it's, it's kind of hard to argue against the guy that turned Ripley and Sarah Connor into icons. I mean, granted, Ridley Scott did with Ripley and Alien, but Aliens is what really cemented her as an action hero. So what is kind of your take on all that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Cameron, as much as I love this movie and I like a lot of his work, I mean, Cameron is a jackass, like as a person, and I think that's fine. I mean, that doesn't take anything away from the greatness of his movies.
Exactly.
And so he's obviously completely wrong about Wonder Woman, and I love Wonder Woman. I think that's a really good movie, and Gal Gadot is great in that movie. And of course, she is a strong female character and a feminist heroine and any of those things that you want to call her. So Cameron is full of himself and is wrong about that, but he is absolutely like a pioneer in creating these kinds of characters and bringing them to the screen. Personally, I love Ripley as a character in all of the movies that she was in. I kind of prefer the original Alien over Cameron's Aliens, but he definitely brought her to that higher level, and that allowed her to do the things that she does then in Alien 3 and in Alien Resurrection, which I also really like, and that's a whole separate topic, but I love all the Alien movies.
Well, when you talk about 1997 on your podcast, you can go on a Josh's Choice defense of Alien Resurrection.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm sure there's better choices. Not that it's the greatest movie ever, but I think what makes any of those movies good is Ripley as a character and the way that she evolves and the way that Sigourney Weaver evolves her. But James Cameron was a big part of that because of what he did in that second movie. So I think he deserves credit for contributing a lot to the depiction of female action heroes in big budget sci-fi and action movies. I think he wants to give himself all the credit and not give it to anyone else, which I think is unfair. And of course, in its own way, is anti-feminist, because as much credit as Cameron deserves, Sigourney Weaver and Linda Hamilton, and for that matter, Gail Ann Hurd, they deserve just as much credit. But yeah, I mean, the transformation of Sarah Connor in this movie is phenomenal. The commitment that Linda Hamilton has to that role, and not only in her physical transformation, but again, in the emotional transformation, going from this scared, skittish person to someone who has this kind of resolve to like a detrimental degree, to the point where she kind of pushes her son away in some fashions and won't show him love because she is so determined to make him into this leader. Just every way that character has developed, she just does a fantastic job with all of it. And I think this movie wouldn't work if you couldn't get emotionally engaged in Sarah, in her relationship with John, and even in her relationship with the Terminator. And that is like the core. As much as there's cool action and one-liners and special effects, there's so much strong emotion in this movie. I think that really makes it work.
Yeah, they basically turn. I mean, that's kind of the point of the movie, is that the three of them turn into kind of a bizarre makeshift family, and I think that is such an important key, that Sarah went through this transformative experience of falling in love while being hunted by a killer robot from the future, and then surviving it with the knowledge that it's all going to, that the clock is ticking on humanity. And Linda Hamilton does a great job of selling that paranoia, that like the effect that having PTSD after going through something like that, but also the paranoia of, well, when is it going to happen? When's it going to, it's just, trying to, is there anything I can do to stop it? I have to protect my son and all that. And I think she does a tremendous job here of carrying the heart of the film in that way. I mean, you have sequences that are, as memorable as not only her mission to kill Miles Dyson, but also the nightmare sequence that's really burns into your head as soon as you watch it, because it's such a kind of horrific vision, and it realizes exactly what you were saying earlier, but this is her worst fear, and this is exactly what she's so frantic to try and prevent happening. And I think the film lets you inside of her head in a way that most movies don't do with their protagonists, female or otherwise. And I think for this kind of movie, it's easy to get lost in the spectacle of it. I mean, I think Terminator 3 is a good example of a movie where the characters are just kind of there, and then they're more focus is on that chase with the truck and all that other stuff, and the effects and the battle with the two Terminators, and not really focusing so much on making it feel real on a character level.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that action movies like this often don't give you that much insight into the emotions of the main characters, whether male or female. And that really understanding Sarah is something that sets this movie apart. And Cameron cares about her as a character as much as he cares about the special effects. And I mean, I think part of the problem with later Cameron is that he obviously cares way more about special effects than about characters these days. But I think the balance in Terminator 2 is really strong. And you get to know Sarah and all the characters. And you mentioned Miles Dyson. Miles Dyson is a great character in this movie because he's so conflicted, and the idea that he's confronted with this reality that everything that he's devoted his life to is going to literally destroy humanity. And he just kind of picks himself up and says, okay, here's the new plan. Here's what we're going to do, and he sacrifices himself. He's sort of the tragic hero of this movie in a way. He is the one who gets killed. He's the one who has to, who has to sacrifice himself in order to save humanity. Without that, more than Sarah, more than John, they would never be able to defeat Skynet. So, and I think Joe Morton is an underrated actor and does a really good job in this movie. Yeah,
specifically, and he's great in everything. I mean, I remember in the 90s especially, he was in this movie, he was in Speed. He had like kind of he was one of those that guys really heavily in the 90s, even more so. And and what I love about that sequence too is not the fact that the fact that he's conflicted, the fact that he makes such an impression which with kind of minimal screen time, and the fact that once she explains everything to him, he's completely on board. He's like, once they convince him, he's like, well, we need to destroy this. Like Sarah just rushes into, like, she's so reactionary that she doesn't even think about, well, maybe he would actually understand and be on my side. Maybe I don't have to murder him in order to stop him from doing this research. And it's sort of that callousness that she's developed since the first film of, well, I have to do whatever I can. And hell, that'll be, even if there's hell to pay to prevent Judgment Day. And I think it's a great moment for her as a character to kind of realize that, ironically, and that's again kind of a major thematic thrust in the movie, she's kind of lost a little bit of her humanity, just as the Terminator is sort of finding its humanity at the same time. And so that really cool dichotomy that they're on sort of parallel tracks, with John kind of being the fulcrum in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. And that she has kind of forced herself to become almost a Terminator-like machine and can't have these strong feelings because that's the only way she knows how to respond to what's happened to her. But yeah, that is great. And she has that moment. Of course, she breaks down. She ultimately can't follow through with killing Miles Dyson. And that shows just how much of a front that she's been putting up all this time, again, because she feels like that's the only way she can possibly react to things. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the idea that once he hears her, like she just tried to kill him. She just shot his house and shot him, in fact, has injured him. And yet he's able to sit down calmly at a table and speak to her and say, okay, you're right. I'm going to now join you on this mission to destroy Cyberdyne. That says a lot about him as a character.
After this giant Austrian man comes into the house and like cuts his arm partially off.
Right.
To be like, look, we're not messing with you. I got a metal endoskeleton. So since we're kind of running through performances here, what do you think about Edward Furlong as John Connor? I think he's, obviously one of the weaker elements of the performance-wise because he had never really acted before, and child actors can be kind of hit and miss. What do you think about his performance here? And I obviously, the fact that he was growing up while this movie was happening, there was a lot of, I don't know how much you know about behind the scenes of this movie, but there's a lot of they had to redub his voice after because it was breaking during the movie. And he's had a growth spurt during production. So they had to kind of account for that. What do you think about him as John Connor? And then I guess in the pantheon of John Connors that we've gotten since then, which was Nick Stahl, Christian Bale, Jason Clarke, if we're going to count that as John Connor. What's your John ranking, I guess?
Well, first of all, he's the best John Connor because all of those other ones are terrible. That's
the correct answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Even if you don't like him in this movie, he's clearly the best because the portrayals of John Connor in the other movies are bad.
Yes.
And I like him in this movie. I mean, yeah, it's not as good a performance as any of the adult actors are giving. And it's not as good a performance as certainly there are instances of child actors who come to their first role at this age and are just fully formed and amazing. And that's not really the case here. But I think he does a pretty good job. And especially because John himself, the whole idea is that he's kind of a dick. As he's this kind of entitled, douchey little kid who resents that his mother has ruined his life by training him to be the leader of the future resistance.
Yeah, no pressure, now, John.
Right. And now he's confronted with, again, like I was saying before, he's confronted with the idea that, oh, shit, this all really is true. Mm-hmm. And now I have to somehow deal with it. And so I think he does a good job of portraying that, and also the bond that he develops with the Terminator, the idea that he has never had a father figure in his life and he latches on to this machine as the father figure and he humanizes the Terminator in his own way. And he humanizes Sarah too, because again, she's made herself into this sort of cold, removed person, and he's able to bring her back to having those emotions. So I think he does probably as well as can be expected. I mean, who's to say if they had cast someone else in this role, if it would have been better? I'm sure they auditioned, hundreds of kids or whatever and found him. It is a little distracting with the overdubbing. You can tell that a lot of those lines have been redubbed, and that's maybe a little distracting. But to me, it doesn't take away from the movie. I think he serves exactly the purpose that he needs to serve in order to make this movie work.
So let's talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger. I this is still his biggest hit, even now, like almost 30 years later. I still think that this is easily his best role, just because it plays off of the. It plays off of his kind of monotone delivery. It plays off of his obviously his build and things like that. And it feel like it's this. There's a whole debate over whether or not Keanu Reeves is a good actor, and I think if you put him in the right role, it works. And for me, this is probably the best application that Arnold has ever played. Even when Cameron put him in True Lies, you're like, okay, spy, yeah. But this guy's pretending to be a computer salesman, and nobody thinks that there's anything weird about that. Certain roles, it doesn't fit him quite as well. Do you agree that this is probably Schwarzenegger's best? I mean, not only his most famous role, but probably the best performances that he's given?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'd have to go look through because he's been obviously in a lot of movies
he's done some smaller dramatic things lately. I know he did that Maggie a few years ago. That was sort of a horror drama, and he's done some other things that I think even I haven't seen. But yeah.
Yeah. I've seen Maggie, and he did another movie, and now it's called Aftermath, I want to say. That was Maggie at least is kind of a genre thing and it has zombies in it. But that other movie is a straight drama where he plays this guy who his family was killed in a plane crash that was based on the air traffic controller's error. And he's dealing with grief and his feelings of resentment at this air traffic controller. And it's a straight drama. And yeah, I think in those movies, he's just not very good. Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right that he, like Keanu Reeves, is really good within his very, very limited range. Yeah. And if you cast him in the right role, he can hit it out of the park. And I think it's possible, again, I'd have to look at the full list to remember. I think it's possible there are other movies like that where he had the right part and he did a really good job. But I would absolutely believe that this is his best role. And he is very good as this character. He's able to go beyond that monotone just enough that you get a little bit of the humor and a little bit of the emotion. But because he's still a robot, he doesn't have to go too far beyond it. So it doesn't challenge Schwarzenegger too much.
It's a kind of a backhanded compliment, I guess. You're great at playing a robot mostly devoid of human emotion.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm like, Schwarzenegger is not a great actor, and I feel like I'm fine with saying that.
Right.
But I think, like Edward Furlong, he does exactly what this movie needs. He gives exactly the right performance for this character in this movie, and he helps with the emotion. I mean, Linda Hamilton really carries the emotion of this movie, but Schwarzenegger helps with it. He gives you something. So I like his performance in this film. It's more of a performance. I mean, in the first movie, he barely has any lines and he's just kind of like stalking and looking grim. Right. And there's not much of a performance there, although it takes some skill to do that. This movie is far more of a performance, and I think it's a really good one. And I think all of the acting is balanced really well. He gives what he needs, and Linda Hamilton and Edward Furlong give that emotional part of it, and Robert Patrick gives you the just menacing villain.
My next topic, I was shifting right over to Robert Patrick next. Yeah.
I mean, they're all good.
Yeah, Robert Patrick is, I mean, this was a star-making role for him. I mean, this was his breakthrough in a lot of ways, and he's still known for this movie specifically, having been on X-Files and like a million other things since then, and he's become much more of a character actor. But yeah, he really sells the kind of steely demeanor of the T-1000. I think he did some training as far as to be able to run like that without, showing any signs of fatigue, and just, I don't know. He really is still probably one of my favorite movie villains of all time, and is also really the conduit of all of the CG. I mean, this was a huge breakthrough for computer-generated imagery. This was apparently, according to my research, first use of a natural human motion for a CG character, and the first partially CG main character. Won Oscars for visual effects and all this, and of course the sound editing and things like that, makeup. So, I mean, let's talk about the effects in this movie and how this is one of those rare examples of an action film from the 90s that still holds up. I mean, I'm thinking this, Jurassic Park, especially from the early 90s, there's not that many that really still don't really. I mean, it's still, if I watch this now, it doesn't. There are like almost zero cringe moments in the movie here as far as the visuals are concerned. The original had a smaller budget, so there's still there's that weird rubber Terminator head. In that one scene in the first one, when he's stripped down to the endoskeleton, it's obviously very stop motiony. But in this one, it's pretty flawless. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it is. The effects are great. I think they do really hold up. And you mentioned Jurassic Park, which I think is absolutely on par with this, that those are both movies that you can watch now and the effects are almost completely seamless. And it's weird to me to watch a movie that was made that long ago and think the effects in this movie look better than effects in movies now in some ways. And I think part of the reason is that because these effects were so new and were so expensive that they could only use them very sparingly. You know, Cameron had to really think about what moments are there when I can use these effects. I mean, there's still moments in this movie where instead of seeing the T-1000 morph, he cuts away and then cuts back so that he doesn't have to show it. And I think as these effects become more prevalent and they become easier to use and less expensive, people rely on them way more. And so it becomes less special and they just kind of throw it in whenever and they don't think about it as much. And so I think that's part of the reason why this holds up is because every effects moment in this movie had to be considered very carefully and used in exactly the right way. And yeah, I think it all looks great. And I think even opposed, again, talking again about Cameron and his obsession with technology, I haven't watched Avatar in a while, but I wouldn't be surprised if Avatar holds up less than Terminator 2 does.
100%. I completely agree with you. And it should be noted, this was the most expensive movie ever made up to this point, which is not, obviously not the first time we could say that about a James Cameron movie. Titanic was like only a few years later. But yeah, it is because of what you said. It is because he was very calculating about when he needed to use the CG and trying to find practical ways around things. I mean, for example, the Linda Hamilton thing, her twin was actually a part of this movie. A lot of people know that now, but at the time we didn't realize it. We're like, oh my God, look how they duplicate Linda Hamilton. Or the deleted scene with the sort of the Terminator brain surgery where you see Linda Hamilton in her reflection in the mirror, but it's actually, her sister is in that scene as well. Things like that are, he finds creative ways around the technology and only implements it when he definitely needs to. And I think there's a benefit to that, not only aesthetically but also just narratively, showing the T-1000 morph off screen and then cuts back and he's fully formed. That also creates a sort of a sense of suspense that you don't get if you just show everything in camera.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. I think, unfortunately, that maybe is something that Cameron has lost. I think Cameron is not the only one who's lost it. Oh, no. Again, I think any action, big budget type filmmaker now has so many resources at their disposal that they don't think about these things as much. But yeah, I think that's great. The security guard in the mental institution also who gets duplicated. I think that's another twin where the actor was playing opposite his own twin brother. Yeah, I don't know what else. Like the effects are great and they serve the story perfectly. And I think, to me also, I remember being 11 years old or whatever, and even as years went by and I got more into films and I saw more movies, I would always say, oh, James Cameron is like my favorite filmmaker. Not only is this my favorite film, but he's my favorite director because he is so good at balancing all these things. And I think he really just kind of lost that. And I'm not looking forward to Avatars, 2 through 5 or whatever he's working on now. Because I think, you could talk about Robert Zemeckis and George Lucas and Ang Lee. We've got Gemini Man about to come out. These filmmakers who get so into the idea of technology that they lose sight of like story and character.
I mean, absolutely. And Ang Lee's whole thing is the high frame rate that he's obsessed with, and everybody's just like, okay, that's great. So make a movie as good as Brokeback or Crouching Tiger again, because it's been a long time. But yeah, no, I agree. And there is a certain point where, I still don't think Cameron's ever really made a bad film, but I agree with you that I don't know why. I think James Cameron is the only person that's really excited about more Avatar movies at this point. That movie was, from a script level, but pretty kind of, mediocre. It's pretty much just the effects and really Zoe Saldana's performance that make that have any kind of impact at all. And I think we're now over a decade later. I'm sure it'll come. I'm probably going to eat my words. In a couple of years, it'll come out and be like, it's amazing. But as of now, it's like I don't really feel like there's any hype for that, and it's in a way kind of disappointing that he's squandering his filmmaking talent on one franchise and just beating it into the ground amid basically no fan clamoring for that. So I mean, this is kind of a good segue into the Terminator franchise. What are overall your thoughts on everything that came after this? Have you ever been on the Terminator 2 3D ride that used to be at Universal? And what do you want to see in Terminator Dark Fate? We're recording this obviously before that film has come out, before we've seen that. So just general Terminator franchise thoughts.
Well, I have not been on the Terminator ride at Universal Studios, so I cannot speak to that. But I have seen the other Terminator films, of course. I kind of have a soft spot for Terminator 3. I think it's obviously nowhere near as good as those first two movies. But if you look at it as just a fun action spectacle, I think it's still fairly entertaining. Schwarzenegger still is having a good time as the Terminator. I like Kristana Loken as the TX or whatever the new generation Terminator is. I thought she did a good job. That was kind of her biggest moment in the spotlight. And Nick Stahl is, it's not that he's that bad as John Connor. I think they just don't know how to characterize John Connor. I think that's a big...
He's kind of a nothing character, I was going to say, in that movie. He's just kind of there, which is disappointing considering he's supposed to be the future of the human resistance. And he's just super vanilla and doesn't feel developed at all. I agree with you.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the problem, is that later filmmakers haven't been able to kind of conceptualize John Connor beyond a symbol. And I think what's really good about Terminator 2 is that the whole character of John Connor is about him himself grappling with the idea that he's supposed to be a symbol. And I think maybe that they just kind of didn't understand that in the later movies. So yeah, I kind of liked I still kind of like T3. It has a great ending. I mean, that super, super bleak ending, where, in such contrast, as much as I like the ending of T2 and Linda Hamilton's narration about the open road and hope for the future, I still am kind of a sucker for an ending where it's like, oh, all of humanity is dead. I kind of like that about it. But yeah, and I mean, Terminator's salvation is terrible. And Christian Bale is bad in that movie, who is, I mean, one of our great actors. And he's just so wrong for John Connor.
Well, we know, thanks to that leaked audio, that he was not happy to be in the movie either. And after seeing the movie, you kind of understand why he reacted that way on set.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of issues with that movie, and Terminator Genisys too. I think starts out promisingly, the idea of redoing aspects of the original and changing it up, I thought was smart, and then it just completely goes off the rails. And the John Connor in that movie is also terrible, and it's so confusing, and I don't know if I could even make sense of it now, what's supposed to be happening in that movie. And I mean, Schwarzenegger is obviously having a good time whenever he can return to this character. And I think that comes through even in Genisys, where it's totally muddled. But I think there's not a whole lot going on in those movies, even in Terminator 3, that's worth it. I think I would have been much happier if they just stopped here. But of course, that's never going to happen. And I mean, I kind of feel that way about Dark Fate, too. Obviously, I haven't seen it yet. All I've seen are trailers. But nothing in those trailers makes me think that this is going to be the one that gets it right. It doesn't look any better than Genisys.
I mean, yeah, the fact that James Cameron is involved after he was, out there shilling for Genisys, being like, oh, this is the third chapter that I would have made, or whatever they had him out there saying. It doesn't give me a lot of faith in this one. I am at least a little encouraged that Linda Hamilton is back finally in this role. That's probably going to be, but I have a feeling that I could easily walk out of that saying that the movie was not very good, but at least Linda Hamilton was in it. So I hope that's not the only thing it has going for it. But I largely agree with what your takes on the other three. The only main reason I mentioned the Universal ride, the Terminator 2 3D Battle Across Time, is because it does have Edward Furlong, and like it's the only continuation that we've gotten thus far with the four people from this movie, the four main cast members, all involved in it. Terminator 3 is fine. I think it is kind of perfunctory overall, and it, especially since the Terminator, it's another Terminator showing up, and this time's after John's wife instead of his mom. It's just like, we're going to do this again. Like even the beginning with the way the Terminator comes, lands and then puts the sunglasses on, parodying the scene from Terminator 2. But I think the ending largely saves it. And there's that great sequence that I mentioned earlier with the truck, the big like chase sequence. Salvation, I think I saw it and fell asleep in theaters and never really went back to revisit it because it was pretty boring. And then Genesis, I think, the first half of it is interesting, even though Jai Courtney is terribly miscast as Kyle Reese. But at least they were trying something different, so I give them credit for that. But overall, I'm very nervous about Dark Fate, and I'm hoping that it's going to be good. But at least if it's not, we can just ignore it like we did like the last couple sequels. So there's that. Yeah,
that's true. And I mean, we just spent all those times praising Linda Hamilton, and that's great that she's back. There's nothing in those trailers that makes me think it's going to be a really interesting portrayal of Sarah Connor, but sure. I'll try to be open-minded about it. I have a hard time. And like you were saying about Cameron, the idea that he said, "Oh, Genesis was the one," and that didn't work out. And now he's like, "Oh, no, this is the one. This is the real sequel." And like we were saying about Avatar and everything, like I'm not sure I trust Cameron on anything anymore. So having him be involved in this movie isn't necessarily a plus. But I also have a general pet peeve of this trend where, now we're making the real sequel to this thing. We're going to ignore all previous sequels. Like, come on, just suck it up. Like, take the challenge of making an actual sequel rather than ignoring all those other ones. Take what you can from them and make it work. I don't know. That's a separate issue. But to me, I don't get excited by that idea. Like, oh, this is the real one. Now it's time to see. Like, no, it just makes the filmmakers seem lazy.
Halloween being one of the most high profile examples of that up to this point. That now apparently it's undoing 30 something years of film, just pretending that none of it happened, just so they can get Jamie Lee Curtis back, pretty much. But yeah, I don't know. I'm of two minds about that. One, I think it's kind of in a way disrespectful to the franchise fans of whatever franchise they're making a follow up to. But at the same time, it does it loosens up the options creatively and what they could do as far as, to undo some of the missteps of the past. So I don't know. It does feel like that's starting to now already to be a crutch that we're going to see way more of than we probably should.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, they already announced a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, the next one being the direct sequel, which has already been done twice in that franchise anyway. So maybe this is a horror movie thing, and I'm a big horror fan, so I see it more often. But yeah, I mean, creative freedom is good, but I don't feel like anyone is doing this in order to really become creatively free. I think they're doing it so that they can even more imitate the movie that people liked. Now we can, everyone liked it when Jamie Lee Curtis was in the Halloween movie. So if we do this, we can bring her back. Everyone liked it when Linda Hamilton was in the Terminator movies. If we do this, we can bring her back.
Right.
So I don't know if it's I don't know that it's a sign of allowing filmmakers more freedom. I think it's a sign of needing something to goose the box office, or I don't know. It just it bugs me. I'm not that the middle Terminator movies are that good, obviously, or that we need to honor them or whatever. I kind of felt like it was a shame with Halloween because they had they really shit on Danielle Harris there, who did a great job in I think it's Halloween 4 and Halloween 5, and then they just erase her from continuity. But that's a separate issue.
Well, it's also this movie ends sort of quasi happily, but with with enough wiggle room for Judgment Day, presumably to get, I guess, kicked further down the timeline. Have you seen the extended edition with that terrible happy ending with Linda Hamilton and old age makeup and all of that?
I have. I didn't watch it this time around. I have like a Blu-ray that has both versions, right. And I felt like the purity of the original version was the right way to go. I have seen that ending at some point in the past, and I feel like this movie works exactly right the way that it is.
Yeah.
And that ending is happy enough that even though, there's the possibility. What's happy about that ending, I think, almost is the possibility of Judgment Day, because the ending there is not that everything is always going to be great forever. The ending there is that humanity is now free to make its own fate. And that's what's important. So, I think that works well. And again, as much as I kind of admire the ending of Terminator 3, I don't think I would have wanted this movie to end with, the failure and Skynet comes online and Judgment Day happens anyway. I don't think that's the right way to go for this one.
Yeah, I agree. And the movie mentioned, brings up a lot of great moral questions. We talked about Sarah's quest with Miles Dyson, and then I think the comment on humanity and us kind of being our own downfall. That's really a fundamental part of kind of all sci-fi, really, if you think about it. And I think the film ends with just enough hope to wrap this story up in a way that doesn't feel too neat, but also doesn't have that like downbeat ending that they really went for in Terminator 3, like you mentioned. So props to I guess Jonathan Mostow for going with that route with the third ending, because if you're gonna do it, that's the way to do it. So I really love that. Let's see, I want to mention the score by Brad Fiedel. How just you have those metallic, and I'm hoping that they bring that theme back for Dark Fate. I'm assuming that they are. It looks like it is in the marketing. So go ahead. What were you going to say about it?
No, I was just going to agree that music is great and it's iconic. To me, it's up there with like anything John Williams has done, and the theme songs from like Halloween and Friday the 13th and things like that, or Psycho, Jaws, or where you hear it like 2 seconds of it and you just are instantly transported.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this movie spawned a ton of catchphrases. Come with me if you want to live, hasta la vista, baby, and all that good stuff. And has an ending that makes pretty much every grown man cry with the I understand now why you cry, but it's something I can never do, with the thumbs up going into the foundry or whatever that is. I thought that was great. And I love the closing line. Since we're talking about the ending so much, I love the closing line that Sarah ends it on. And she says, the unknown future rolls toward us. I face it for the first time with a sense of hope. Because if a machine, a Terminator, can learn the value of human life, maybe we can too. I love that. That's such a perfect note to end the movie on. And, we kind of talked about the ending, but any further thoughts on the ending? Just because it is essentially a perfect movie ending for this genre, for this story that has been told, that you feel sort of, you feel like they're uplifted by it in kind of a weird way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, like I said, what's great about it is that it's hopeful, but it doesn't feel fake. I think that alternate ending would almost undermine it, because if like everything is so great, you assume that like, oh, well, they're just delusional and things are going to fall apart. But ending it on a note of like, well, maybe things will work out, I think gives you a lot of hope. Which is nice to have, and it ties in with all the themes of the movie about learning to appreciate humanity and the connections that people have with each other. And maybe we'll still screw it up and we'll still kill each other, but at least now we have a chance.
Exactly.
I think it's great. The voiceover, Linda Hamilton. I mean, throughout the movie, the kind of musings that she has on human nature, I think fit really well. And they're maybe cheesy at times, but I think they work in the context of what the movie's trying to do.
Absolutely. I don't really have a whole lot else in my notes. Is there anything specifically about Terminator 2 Judgment Day that we haven't talked about thus far that you want to make sure that we cover?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we covered all the really good performances, the effects, the writing. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I feel like this is pretty much the perfect movie, or at least the perfect blockbuster movie. And I think we pretty much talked about. You know what? The one thing that I'll mention is Earl Bowen as Dr. Silberman. And Screen Crush recently had a great article like in appreciation of Dr. Silberman, who is other than Arnold Schwarzenegger, the only actor to appear in all of the first 3 Terminator movies.
That's true.
Because he's in Terminator 3 as well. And he's just a great background character. And the way that he has such contempt for Sarah Connor, and his world is also shattered there because he's the only person who witnessed the Terminator, the original Terminator in 1984, and then sees the Terminator again. So he's just, this movie is full of great little moments, and I think he is maybe an unsung element of this franchise. So that is the last thing that I will add.
No, I agree with you. I think he's basically kind of the stand-in for the rest of humanity. I think kind of just tracking the story from an everyman's perspective, just kind of, the disbelief of what happened in the first one, and then the second one with when the cigarette, I think he has a cigarette in his mouth that he drops when he sees the Terminator go through the T-1000 go through the bars, all of that stuff. I think he adds a lot to it with, again, very little screen, especially in the third one. I think it's just basically a cameo. And it does serve that purpose of here's what an outsider's perspective looks like to this crazy like sci-fi post-apocalyptic mess that's happening all around us.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. So Josh, can you tell people where they can find you on social media?
You can find me on social media at Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook. You can find me at Signal Bleed on Twitter. You can find me on my website at joshbellhateseverything.com. And if you want to listen to Awesome Movie Year, you can go to awesomemovieyear.com. Follow us at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, and search for Awesome Movie Year wherever you like to get podcasts.
Awesome. Well, Josh Bell, this has been a lot of fun. It's a nice refresher for me as far as with Terminator franchise, where I guess we left it off now with Dark Fate. Because the last 3 movies didn't count. So this was a great conversation. Thanks for coming on the show, and I would love to have you back at some point down the line and talk about something else.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I look forward to coming back.
Awesome. Thanks, man. If you're interested in joining me on the show to chat about one of your favorite films, head on over to crookedtable.com/guest. Or you can consider supporting the show at patreon.com/crookedtable. Of course, you can always find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies over at crookedtable.com. Until next time, this has been the Crooked Table Podcast, and I've been Rob.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
C-R-O-O-K-E-D.